Love listening to the games that he's a part of, and a great guest on this show. Brock Huard, Fox Sports, joins me. David Smoke on 365 Sports. Was the weather, the travel issues kind of a problem to get into Lubbock the last day?
Ooh, yeah. Well, I make home now south of Denver up there in the Rocky Mountains, and it started snowing Tuesday, kind of into Wednesday. I knew that it'd be a little rough yesterday. I can't complain. I had a couple hour delay, and we got out of there. But Matt Leinart and my buddy Jason Benetti, I think they rolled into town about 4 a.m. this morning after delays, landing in Midland, having to fly back into Lubbock. It was a little more adventurous for some, but I don't think the Buffs had too big of an issue, and thankfully to get out of the snow. And looks like, Smokey, it's going to be just a perfect day for football tomorrow.
It's a great, like a collision course, and of course Texas Tech made it even more so because of the win when they beat Iowa State in Ames after a tough couple of losses to Baylor and TCU. What do you see what they're doing? Because they've had a nice stretch, and then they had those 2 losses with Baron Morton, Taj Brooks, and company.
Yeah, I think that's just it. Quite a bit of experience and poise. Kelly's been around the block an awful lot. Baron now has seen a ton in his career. This morning we got to sit down. I got to watch practice with Texas Tech, and then we sit with the coaches and sit with Taj and sit with Jacob Rodriguez. And you know what you sit with, Smokey? You sit with grown men. I'm looking at my big board between these 2 teams. Colorado's got quite a phenom at left tackle, Jordan Seaton. He was a 5-star, number 1 rated offensive lineman. He's really the only freshman that plays for Colorado. Nobody defensively. They're all largely 5th and 6-year guys. I got a couple second-year players, but by and large, these are 21, 22, 23-year-old guys that are really mature. You see the same thing with them offensively with Shadeur and all their receivers. They've all been there and done that and seen so much football. So none of them feel overwhelmed. And I would say the same thing largely about Texas Tech. Obviously Hudson's been a guy that has been banged up this year as a true freshman. But once again, I'm kind of looking at my board here. Do I see a freshman anywhere? Backup QB, Hammond obviously got a little run there at TCU and did a nice job. But outside of that, I don't see a true freshman really contributing other than the left tackle for Colorado on this entire football field tomorrow.
Yeah, isn't that interesting? Because and do you feel like even though those teams get good players in Colorado with Dion and what he does, and Joey with what he recruits, but is that just now life in college football more often than not with the transfer portal?
It is, but this is pretty stark. This one here in this matchup really speaks to that they're just, for a freshman to try to come in and unseat either of these guys that you have brought in, and in the case of Colorado, a lot of them, and we've heard Dion talk about that over the last couple years, and the amount of, you kind of just look to build a team. They have built it largely through free agency. Now he brought a bunch of his son and others, and the super talented Travis from Jackson State, kind of like Signetti did to Indiana. So he's got familiarity with a half dozen or more that he brought from there. But yeah, they've largely built it through that free agent portal, and then it's a little different. Ohio State, Oregon, Georgia, some of the teams at the top of the college football playoff, they have still largely gone through the high school development end. And I think I know that's what Joey wants to do. And he's done a good job the last 2 classes. You've got a bunch of redshirt freshmen that are certainly contributing. It's just really hard for those guys right out of high school.
Brock, the Big 12, and you've covered them enough that it's even with Texas and Oklahoma moving on, it's like a potpourri, like a pot of gumbo of different type of styles and personalities and teams from the different realignment. And we've seen this before. 21 Baylor won a lot of close games, and they had an incredible team. Then 22 TCU made the run before Georgia smoked them, which they did that to most everybody. And now this year, BYU's won some close games, among others. You cover a lot of college football. There's a lot of blue bloods, but not so much in this conference. Is it one of the deepest or widest or maybe most fun conferences to cover?
Yeah, it is wild. I will tell you that. Like week to week, man, there is so much variety of scheme. I know we're going to go meet with Dion and his staff, and this will be our third CU game that we have done this year. And obviously it's been well documented that Dion, likes not only experienced players, he also likes experienced coaches that have a lot of NFL background. His OC, Pat Shurmur, and his defensive coordinator, Livingston, basically lived in the whole NFL game more than anybody else. And it's fun talking to them, and especially Pat Shurmur, because he just speaks to that. He's like, man, the NFL, you got 32 teams, and basically everybody largely does the same thing in scheme. Miami introduced some RPO, the Dolphins, and there's some varieties. Obviously, what Lamar does in Baltimore is different. But by and large, everybody plays a four-man front. You see a lot of the same coverages. Third down and red zone is really the game. And like Pat says, this college game is way more fluid. And you can see Cincinnati and Iowa State, three-man front, 3-3-5 defense, and it's totally different than Colorado's real NFL man-to-man defense. Texas Tech with the Rooters trying to find solutions to do just about everything with the kitchen sink and all sorts of formations and personnel grouping. So, it's the Wild West. That conference that I used to play in and cover is really no longer, and this has become certainly the Big 12, the Wild West.
There was a lot of heat on Dave Aranda and Baylor, and early on, none of that changed because they had a rough start. And, of course, the Hail Mary against Colorado and losing that game the way they did. They've now won 3 in a row. Really not so much out of nowhere, but pretty much out of nowhere because the first one was against Texas Tech in Lubbock. What do you see from what he's done to maybe turn this thing back around?
Well, I see a little more continuity at quarterback.
Yep.
I think early this year, and we had them up at Utah, and golly, that feels like 2 seasons ago with everything that's gone down at Utah, and then the turnaround at Baylor. It doesn't even feel like the same kind of teams. But remember, Baylor obviously tried to go a different route at quarterback that was not going to work with Spavital. You could even feel that early in the season. Just wasn't his kind of QB, that he needs to spray the ball everywhere and get the ball out of his hands and do all of that. So they've settled down there. But I would say this, Smoke, like the other thing about the Big 12, and you'll see it with Colorado tomorrow. You see it with BYU. I just saw it with Houston, with Baylor. There's some really good front fours defensively. Now, it's not Georgia and it's not Oregon, but they're really, really solid. And they're ahead of certainly lots of other schools in that way. So when we saw Baylor, I'm like, man, these edge players are good. Your linebacker's pretty good. Dave's got some salty dudes there. When I saw Willie Fritz's Houston Cougars last week, who also have won 3 of 4, I'm like, man, this defensive front, you just don't move around. Again, grown men, a lot of production, played other places, but they know how to play the game. So a bunch of veterans in these front sevens around the Big 12, or BYU, as I mentioned in there earlier, Colorado, who you're going to see tomorrow. That's made a significant difference to solidify their teams from the inside out right at the line of scrimmage.
Brock, I have to admit this. I did on the show, I think, on Monday. I went to go look at, I think it might have been Washington's record, your Washington's record, and I went and tried to find where they were in the Pac-12 because – I'm old school, and I know they're in the Big Ten, and I knew that. How often have you done that this year where you were looking for somebody and they're in not the right conference anymore?
Oh, it's pretty wild. Yeah, it's it is. It's still surreal to me when I've called some of these games and I see that Big Ten logo. We did Washington at Iowa. We've done Oregon a couple times, and you're just like, man, that just doesn't. I don't know, like where did that Pac-12 go? Or I'll try to watch and see Stanford and Cal playing at Wake Forest and Clemson and NC State and SMU. Like, this is an ACC game? Like, none of this still has really sunk in and been sensical, but it is the era we live in. And now I will say this, like, as crazy as that is, what's coming in the next few weeks with the playoffs, and obviously the first playoff rankings this week, as you start to look at that, I mean, it is as healthy as it's been, I think, competitively. And when we get to those 12 teams, I think all of us that have covered this game like you have for decades, when we do get to that point, it is going to be like Christmas morning with some kind of special present under the tree.
Yeah, teams get to play on their home campus, even though they won't have that first round bye with conference champions, but they get to play on their home campus. I know you got another meeting to get to. What are your thoughts about, do you think, no matter what is said with Ward Manuel or any other ones in the past, is there any kind of, in your opinion, an issue with the logos on the helmets when they come to those rankings?
Yeah, I don't. Yeah, I mean, it's the bias you're talking about,
Yeah.
the logos, the
Yep.
history.
Yep.
Yeah, I mean, there's human beings that are doing that job. I will say this: the Mike Rileys of the world, who's on that committee this year, I know that they will work their very best to eliminate as much of that bias as they can. I know that with 12 teams, it's going to be so much easier in some regards to get those teams and really reward those teams who've had a remarkable season and a remarkable run. We won't have what we had some years ago with Baylor and
Yep.
TCU and some of these teams that you knew were deserving to be in the competition. With 12, you're going to get 12 pretty darn good deserving teams. And on paper right now, some pretty compelling matchups.
Last thing, your daughter Macy, I've watched it. She's really good. Saw you sit down with an interview. What's that like watching her compete?
Yeah, pretty neat. Yeah, pretty neat. And, these resources in this Big 12 are different. And she started her career at Montana with Big Sis, who finished her career there. And she knew she just has kind of a lion's heart to compete and really wanted to be the best. And Smokey, that's the thing is, yeah, the Big Ten and the SEC and all that and all the firepower they have and the contracts and yada, yada, yada. But you travel around like we did to Houston last week and you see what they're building. I'm in Lubbock today, walk through their facility, what they're building. So many of these across the conference, Iowa State that has done such a beautiful job upgrading their building. Like there is more than enough resources for these schools. And this year, I don't know if they'll get more than one into this playoff, but in time they will. And then it's upon them to go make some noise in it.
Go have a great broadcast, Brock. Enjoy your time. I know you will. Thanks for your time, sir. Appreciate it.
You betcha, man.
Thank
you bet,
you.
Smokey.
Brock Huard with us, Fox Sports. Always enjoy his insight